extreme drought in Panama is forcing authorities to substantially scale back shipping through the Panama Canal, one of the world's key shipping channels.
China's running the Panama Canal. That was not given to China, that was given to Panama foolishly.
For over a century, the Panama Canal has been crucial for global trade, but now it faces a major challenge. The canal is struggling with growing demand and severe droughts, pushing countries and billionaires into a $270 billion race to build a new route. From China's involvement to high-speed rail, dry canals, this competition is becoming a geopolitical showdown. Who will control trade's future of the canal, and can a new route truly replace it? Join us as we unravel the race to replace the Panama Canal as stakes are higher than ever. Building the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal is one of the most important waterways on Earth, playing a massive role in global trade. Around 6% of the world's shipping passes through this narrow, 82-kilometer stretch of water, making it a crucial shortcut for cargo moving between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. If you live on the east coast of the United States, there's a good chance that the device you're using right now was shipped through this canal. That's how vital it is. In fact, many cargo ships are built based on the canal's dimensions, categorized by whether they can fit through its locks. By navigating through the Panama Canal, ships avoid a grueling 20,000-kilometer journey around the southern tip of South America, a route infamous for its treacherous waters and unpredictable storms. On a map, it seems like an obvious place to dig a canal, but building it was far from easy. The landscape presented enormous challenges, and the final design we see today only came after a disastrous first attempt that cost thousands of lives and ruined the reputations of some of France's most brilliant engineers. In 1869, French engineer Ferdinand de Lesseps became a national hero after successfully completing the Suez Canal in Egypt, a feat that connected the Mediterranean and Red Seas. Encouraged by this success, he set his sights on an even more ambitious project, carving a sea-level canal straight through the jungles of Panama. In 1880, de Lesseps launched his grand vision, digging a massive trench from coast to coast, just as he had done in Egypt. But there was one major problem. Panama was nothing like the Egyptian desert. While the Suez Canal was built on flat, dry land, Panama's terrain was mountainous and covered in dense tropical rainforest. The Isthmus of Panama, although narrow, is one of the most rugged areas in Central America, with hills, rivers, and deep, unstable soil. The region's soft clay turned into a muddy disaster zone when it rained, making excavation extremely difficult. Despite these warnings, de Lesseps insisted on a sea-level canal, refusing to consider alternatives. His confidence, built on his previous success, led to disastrous consequences. Almost immediately, the project ran into serious problems. The most challenging section, the Calabar Cut, had to be constantly widened due to landslides that kept burying workers and equipment. The heavy rainfall turned the worksite into a swamp, and the primitive steam shovels they relied on quickly rusted and broke down. Even worse, the tropical environment became a breeding ground for deadly diseases like malaria and yellow fever. Thousands of workers, many of them brought in from the Caribbean, fell sick and died. Engineers, including some of de Lesseps' top men, succumbed to illness, further stalling the project. By 1889, the venture was in complete chaos. The cost had spiraled to a staggering $208 million, and more than 22,000 workers had lost their lives. The project collapsed, leading to one of the biggest financial scandals in French history. De Lesseps, along with other key figures, including Gustave Eiffel, the designer of the Eiffel Tower, was put on trial, fined, and even sentenced to prison. The failed canal was abandoned, left as a half-dug trench in the jungle. It wasn't until 1904 that the project was revived, this time by the United States. Learning from France's mistakes, American engineers abandoned the idea of a sea-level canal and instead came up with a brilliant alternative. They would build a series of locks to lift ships over the land rather than digging straight through it. 3 sets of locks were constructed at each end of the canal, allowing ships to be raised 26 meters above sea level. The Calabar Cut, the same section that had plagued the French effort, was finally completed, and a massive dam was built across the Chagres River, creating one of the largest artificial lakes in the world. With better equipment and new medical breakthroughs, including mosquito control measures to fight malaria, the Americans managed to finish what the French could not. In just 10 years, the Panama Canal was completed, opening in 1914. It was celebrated as an engineering marvel and a symbol of America's growing power on the world stage. Not only did the canal revolutionize global trade, but it also contained some of the most impressive engineering feats of its time. The dam created Gatun Lake, the largest man-made lake in the world at the time, and the locks were among the most advanced hydraulic systems ever built. But how did Panama gain control of the canal? Let's take a closer look. The Panama Canal Treaties. One of President Jimmy Carter's most significant achievements was the negotiation of the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, which were approved by the U.S. Senate in 1978. These agreements granted Panama eventual control of the Panama Canal, a landmark moment in history. In the early 20th century, the United States gained the right to build and manage the Panama Canal. Through the Hay-Herran Treaty of 1903, the U.S. secured the rights to the land around the proposed canal, after negotiations with Colombia. However, the Colombian Senate rejected the deal, and at the same time, Panama was moving toward independence from Colombia. U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt supported Panama's independence, seeing an opportunity to secure control of the canal. This support led to the signing of the Hay-Buno-Varilla Treaty on November 18, 1903, giving the U.S. permanent control over the canal zone. Though the agreement was controversial, the treaty had been negotiated by Philippe Jean Buno-Varilla, a Panamanian representative who lacked formal authority and hadn't lived in Panama for years. Even though the canal opened in 1914, many Panamanians remained doubtful about the treaty's fairness. As the 20th century unfolded, tensions grew between the U.S. and Panama over the canal. In 1964, a violent clash broke out over the right to fly Panama's flag in the canal zone, temporarily halting diplomatic relations. Despite the conflict, both nations recognized the need for a new agreement. In 1967, the U.S. and Panama agreed on 3 treaties related to the canal's future, but political instability in Panama disrupted further progress. In 1968, President Marco Robles was ousted in a coup, and Colonel Omar Torrijos took control, adding uncertainty to the negotiations. Torrijos, like his predecessors, was determined to reach an agreement with the U.S. By 1975, U.S. officials were also eager to secure a new treaty. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger warned President Ford that failure to negotiate would lead to significant political backlash in Latin America. In 1973, the Nixon administration appointed Ellsworth Bunker to lead the U.S. delegation. Bunker focused on ensuring the U.S. could continue to use the canal indefinitely, but without controlling the canal zone. Between 1973 and 1976, Bunker's team reached a series of draft agreements with Panama, which would later form the foundation for the Torrijos-Carter Treaties. The 1976 presidential elections were a critical time for the negotiations. President Ford supported a new canal treaty, but his challenger, Ronald Reagan, opposed it. Jimmy Carter, the Democratic candidate, initially seemed against giving up control of the canal. In a debate with Ford, Carter stated he would not relinquish practical control of the Panama Canal Zone. However, after winning the election, Carter's views began to shift. His advisors, Saul Linowitz and Cyrus Vance, persuaded him of the importance of a new treaty. When Carter assumed office, he made negotiating a new deal with Panama a priority and appointed Linowitz to work alongside Bunker. Despite both Carter and Torrijos wanting a treaty, numerous challenges remained. For a treaty to take effect, it needed the approval of 2/3 of the U.S. Senate, and many senators opposed granting Panama control of the canal zone. One vocal critic was Senator Strom Thurmond, who believed the loss of the canal would weaken U.S. security. Many conservative senators also distrusted Torrijos, whom they suspected of communist sympathies. Faced with such opposition, Carter's administration had to work tirelessly to win over both the public and Congress. To gain Senate approval, the administration held numerous public forums, explaining the benefits of the treaties. Torrijos also worked to reassure U.S. lawmakers by hosting senators in Panama, emphasizing that he was not an enemy of the U.S. nor a communist. Even conservative figures like actor John Wayne supported the negotiations. Ultimately, the two sides agreed to submit 2 separate treaties to the Senate. The first, the Neutrality Treaty, allowed the U.S. to defend the canal if necessary, while the second, the Panama Canal Treaty, set a date for the canal zone's transfer to Panama, December 31, 1999. Both treaties were signed on September 7, 1977. It took over 6 months for the Senate to vote on the treaties. Opponents of the agreements proposed amendments to make them more difficult to approve. But in the end, the treaties passed. The Senate ratified the Neutrality Treaty on March 16, 1978, with a 68-32 vote, and the Panama Canal Treaty followed shortly after, passing with the same margin on April 18, 1978. The implementation legislation was signed into law by Carter on September 27, 1979. The Torrijos-Carter treaties were a diplomatic triumph, allowing the U.S. to defend the canal without facing charges of imperialism. While the treaties marked a period of cooperation between the U.S. and Panama, relations soured after Torrijos' death in 1981. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush ordered an invasion of Panama to oust leader Manuel Noriega. By 1999, however, tensions had eased, and the Panama Canal was officially handed over to Panama, which has managed it ever since. Panama Canal crisis. Since it first opened, the Panama Canal has been a vital route for global trade, allowing ships to pass between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans without having to take a long and dangerous trip around South America. In 2010, the canal celebrated a major milestone when its 1 millionth ship passed through its locks. However, things haven't been smooth sailing since then. One of the biggest challenges the canal faces today is a severe water shortage. A massive drought forced officials to declare a state of emergency and limit the size of ships that could pass through. The canal's clever design was meant to bypass the region's soft terrain, but ironically, it has also become its greatest weakness. Each time a ship moves through a lock, nearly 200 million liters of water are used. Although the newest locks can recycle about 60% of this water, the canal still depends heavily on the rainy season from May to December to keep water levels high. But in 2015, disaster struck. The rainy season was the driest in over a century, largely due to El Niño, a climate phenomenon that brings extreme weather to different parts of the world. In Central and South America, El Niño can trigger severe droughts, and scientists warn that climate change is making these events more frequent and more intense. That prediction came true in 2023 when the canal suffered its longest dry spell in history. The impact was devastating. On a normal day, up to 40 ships can pass through the canal, but by November 2023, that number had dropped to just 24. By February, it was expected to fall even further, creating a massive traffic jam. At one point, 160 ships were stuck in line, waiting for their turn to cross. Those that did manage to get through weren't operating at full capacity. Larger ships like the Neo-Panamax container vessels were forced to carry 40% less cargo to avoid getting stuck in the shallow water. The crisis also led to a bidding war for passage. While most ships book their slots in advance, canal authorities auction off a few last-minute spots to the highest bidder. In November 2023, a tanker carrying liquefied natural gas paid a jaw-dropping $4 million, on top of the standard $400,000 fee, just to skip the line. So what's being done to fix this problem? Let's find out. Searching for solutions. In September 2023, officials approved a plan to build a new reservoir to supply the canal with more fresh water. This idea was originally proposed in the 1990s and involves damming the Indio River to create an artificial lake, which would then channel water to Lake Gatun via an 8-kilometer tunnel. But there's a big obstacle in the way. A law passed in 2006, which allowed for the canal's expansion, also banned the construction of new reservoirs. For this plan to move forward, that law would have to be overturned, and that's not going to happen without a fight. Panama has already been rocked by months of protests over a controversial mining contract with a Canadian company, which critics argue threatens the country's environment and water supply. If a new reservoir is proposed, it will likely face fierce opposition as well. As Panama struggles with its water crisis, other projects are gaining attention, some of which could bypass the canal altogether. One option being explored is a long-discussed canal through Nicaragua. In May 2023, Nicaragua's foreign minister hinted at a possible partnership with Belarus to revive this century-old idea. The United States first considered this route in the early 20th century, but ultimately chose Panama because it was shorter. Meanwhile, in neighboring Colombia, a Florida-based company called Zoran is working on an even more futuristic solution. In 2022, they proposed building a 130-kilometer tunnel that would use magnetic levitation, maglev, trains to transport shipping containers from one coast to the other in just 30 minutes. However, the most serious challenge to the Panama Canal comes from Mexico's interoceanic corridor. This project, which is already under construction, will use roads and railways to move cargo and passengers across a 300-kilometer stretch of land. This isn't a new idea either. The road originally had a railway back in 1907, but it was abandoned after the Panama Canal opened 7 years later. In September 2023, freight services resumed, and supporters believe this time they have the advantage. It will be years before we know the fate of the Panama Canal. Will it remain a dominant force in global trade, or will it become just one of many options? Let's take a closer look. The future of the Panama Canal. Beyond the economic and environmental concerns, there's a deeply human story often overlooked. The Panama Canal isn't just a waterway, it's the lifeblood for thousands of families who rely on it for their jobs and livelihoods. Entire communities are built around the canal, and its potential decline raises tough questions about the future of these families, whose lives are intricately linked to its operations. The canal's stability also affects vital public services like schools and hospitals, as they depend on its economic success to keep running. Beyond the practical, the canal is also woven into the cultural fabric of the region. Local markets thrive, and age-old traditions are preserved, all thanks to the economic pulse provided by this waterway. As discussions about its future continue, local leaders, environmental activists, and concerned citizens are raising their voices to protect what is not just an economic asset, but a cornerstone of their community's identity. The Panama Canal is far more than just a path for ships. It's a lifeline, shaping everything from people's day-to-day routines to their long-term hopes. While alternatives like the Arctic Passage or other new canals sound appealing, they carry heavy environmental consequences. Melting ice caps in the Arctic, a direct result of climate change worsened by increased shipping traffic, threaten fragile ecosystems and contribute to the rise in sea levels. Building new canals often leads to deforestation, loss of habitats, and further harm to wildlife. Additionally, the surge in maritime activity brings industrial pollution that harms marine life and coastal communities. Environmental activists argue that the focus should shift towards sustainable solutions, like renewable energy, that can reduce the environmental toll of global trade. It's clear, our planet's health depends on the choices we make today. Striking a balance between economic growth and environmental protection is more critical than ever, with lasting impacts for generations to come. In the world of global trade, routes are more than just paths for goods, they are political powerhouses. Controlling these routes can shift the balance of global influence, and the Panama Canal, as a key trade route, has long been at the center of international strategies. Nations understand that whoever controls the canal has enormous sway over global commerce. The push to replace or create alternatives to the Panama Canal isn't just about economic gain, it's about geopolitical power. Countries are pouring billions of dollars into these new projects, each hoping to tip the scale in their favor. As global trade volumes soar, the importance of these trade routes is becoming more obvious, and the competition is heating up. The stakes in this race are not just economic, they're geopolitical. New routes could change the alliances between countries, creating new partnerships or sparking rivalries. The control over these trade routes can dictate a nation's economic future and its place on the global stage. The Panama Canal and the race to replace it are at the heart of this high-stakes battle for control of international trade. This isn't just about moving goods. It's about dominating global trade, promoting environmental sustainability, and driving innovation. The decisions we make now will shape the direction of global commerce for decades. Looking ahead, we cannot ignore the importance of sustainable practices. Integrating green energy and advanced technology into trade systems is essential for the future. Innovations in logistics and transportation will change how we move goods worldwide, and the future of global trade will require not only efficiency but also resilience and adaptability. The digital transformation in shipping will enhance transparency and security, bringing new levels of accountability to the industry. Our choices today will echo through the years, impacting the global economy. The future of trade will rely on cooperation between nations and a skilled, diverse workforce. The race to replace or complement the Panama Canal is on, and it's a race driven by necessity, ambition, and innovation, one that will determine the future of global commerce. What do you think about the intense race to replace the Panama Canal? Let us know your answer in the comments section. Don't forget to like and subscribe.